I want to illustrate the impact of loneliness and the positive impact of social connection by telling you about a couple of women who lived in the first nursing home that I worked in. This was back in the 1990s. So Frida moved into our nursing home. She had been a teacher all of her life, had enjoyed a rich intellectual life, loved reading, loved conversing, loved talking about ideas, loved learning new things. But she was legally blind and had gotten to the point that she was no longer able to live alone. And so she moved into a nursing home. She went from, her house to one room. She went from being able to read and acquire language knowledge that way to not being able to. It was a big change for her. But on Frida's first day in the nursing home that I worked in, she methodically went from office to office to office and met each one of us, asked our names, asked our stories, told us a little of her story. She did the same thing with residents who lived around her. And all in all, she had I think she would even call it a fairly contented life living at the nursing home. The other woman I want to tell you about, a woman named Catherine. She came into the nursing home with really just a mild condition. She had suffered a mild stroke. She needed some physical therapy. She would have to make some adjustments in her life, but the expectation was that she would return essentially to her previous functioning. However, she came in and was unhappy from the get-go, did not like being in the nursing home, was mad about having had the stroke, and had the mindset that she was going to fight against this thing. And one of her ways by fighting against it was not joining into this community that she was living with. Catherine's time at the nursing home was very different from Frida's. She did not appear to ever enjoy herself. She did not know the people around her. She did not know many of us staff very well. Her health declined, and she eventually died in the nursing home without having been able to return back to her house. I think that this story of Frida and Catherine illustrates a lot of things about aging and the attitude you bring to aging, but I think it also illustrates how being connected in the world, being a part of your environment, whatever that environment is, adds just a lot of richness to your life. So having given you that bit of illustration, today I want to talk a little bit more about loneliness and social isolation. They are used fairly interchangeably, but they are actually two different concepts. I want to talk a little bit about older adults. One of the things that we know is that interventions to help people have more connections, be less lonely, really are successful if they fit with an older adult's preferences or lifestyle or personality. So I'm going to give you some very general information about the cohort of older adults. And then we're going to talk about social isolation in relation to the public health crisis, coronavirus, how social isolation has gotten to be so prominent or something that we hear about so often. And certainly if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. I saw somebody had raised their hand, but I'm not going to be able to do much with that while I'm speaking, but please type your question in the chat box, and I would love to field questions and have as much of a back and forth as is possible at the end of this. All right, so I feel like, whoops, let's see how I can go to the next slide. There we go. I feel like the public attitude towards social distancing has changed a lot over these past 7 or 8 months of the pandemic. At the beginning, I don't know if you saw similar memes to this that seemed to make light of the idea of social isolation. Things that indicated that, our grandparents had to go off and fight a war. That was their call to service. And our call to service was going to be relatively easy comparatively. All we had to do was sit on the sofa and be by ourselves. What we actually really learned is that social isolation is a tough thing. It might not be physically tough. All you have to do is sit around and decide if you're going to be at the sofa today or the dining room or wherever. But emotionally, it leaves us feeling out of control of our situations. And humans are typically stressed by lack of control. So just from the very get-go, the fact that we were not able to direct our lives in the way that we wanted to, that we had to listen to outside guidance or outside restrictions, was a stressful thing to begin with. It's also hard because we don't have access to our normal coping strategies. For example, religious services, getting together with friends, things like that are practices that help us normally reduce stress. And those were the very things that were cut out early on in the pandemic. And so this idea of being socially isolated then leads people to feeling lonely. Loneliness in and of itself causes a number of physical issues. It causes elevated symptoms of anxiety, of depression, raised blood pressure. People's immune functions are lowered when they are feeling lonely. It contributes to the problem of obesity, contributes to cognitive decline. And it makes people particularly vulnerable to viral infections because of the decline in myeloid cells that generate interferon responses. So right away, you can see that this thing that we're being told to do to help us be resistant to the virus is also a thing that makes us more vulnerable to the virus. In addition, loneliness and social isolation change a person's practical health arrangements, which affects your social determinants of health. This probably particularly applies to older adults if they don't have the access of friends or families or support systems to help them go to medical appointments, to pick up their medications, to do things like that with them. I think, though, during this pandemic, we have also seen how humans are driven or drawn to being connected to other people. It was really heartwarming to see, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, when Europeans were gathering on their separate balconies and singing together or having exercise classes across the roadway from each other. So you can see that there's this biological drive to be with other people. So I think all of this concludes, sorry about that it's harder for us to be apart than you would think it would be. So let's drill down a little bit and talk about exactly what these two phenomena are. Loneliness is defined as a subjective and an unwelcome feeling, which results from a mismatch in the quality and quantity of social relationships that we have and that we desire. So there are two types of loneliness. There's social loneliness. That is if I don't have as many casual connections as I used to have before. If I don't have as many friends that I can gather and play bridge with, or that I can chat with over the dining room table. Emotional loneliness, on the other hand, is that feeling that you get when you don't have an intimate or a close connection, if you've lost a confidant in your life or don't have as much access to them. Loneliness also has a biological basis. We are driven to be with other people. It used to be evolutionarily that if we were lonely, we might not have the access to the safety and the security that a group provided. And so we were drawn to be with other people. Loneliness also has cultural influences. We Americans are taught from the get-go that we pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and go on our own way. There's sort of this competing drive that we don't need anybody. We should be able to solve all of our own problems. And perhaps that idea that I should be able to do something on my own makes people feel more lonely if on the one hand they want connections and on the other hand they feel like they're supposed to be able to do things on their own. There are some moderating factors to loneliness, though. One is the emotional significance. As we said before, there's a difference if you are missing casual connections versus missing a really close confidant. It might be easier to cope with loneliness. It might be easier to navigate a lonely world, I guess, if you still have that close connection, say to a family or say to a spouse that you have a good relationship with, than it would be if you were to lose that deep connection. Another moderating influence is how long loneliness lasts. And I think that as we enter the 8th month of this pandemic, we're starting to see that. It feels that a lot of people feel that things are really weighing on them. I think you hear in the news about pandemic malaise. It's getting old, all of this staying apart. Maybe it's worth it to try to be together. Social isolation, on the other hand, is just a number. It's a lack of social connections. And social isolation can come from a couple of different causes. There are internal factors that lead to social isolation. These are the things that I tend to think of first, and maybe the things that are most often associated with aging, but chronic health conditions that make you unable to get out as much. Sensory impairments that make it harder to see or hear or speak or take in information, even if you're able to physically be by somebody. I know an example of that for me was when I was sitting in a discussion group with a lot of older adults, and was letting a student facilitate the group. And we had one woman who was a member of the group who was speaking at the time, that because her voice was so soft due to her aging process, it was very hard to feel connected to her. Even though I was sitting in the group, I didn't feel much like part of the group. Disabilities make it harder for people to be connected, make it harder for people to be with those that they're friends with. Certainly changes in income and poverty. Retirement is oftentimes a real marker in a person's life when they might start to feel more isolated. If you are not in a workplace on a daily basis and seeing your coworkers, that's a real change in the number of connections that you can experience. I think all of us who are working at home have had a small taste of that as well. What is it like for you when you sit at your dining room table by yourself all day long? And yes, you're furiously answering emails and Slack conversations, but it's not quite the same as if you see somebody when you're both waiting at the copy machine to pick up your papers. And characteristics of your social ties can also influence your ability to be with a social group. So death of your friends declining mobility, perhaps geographical distance. As an older adult's close friends move to be near family, it's not so easy, or it's not feasible even to get with them anymore. Social isolation is also caused by external factors. This is your built environment. If your sidewalk allows you to get out and go visit the person down the road, if you live in a safe environment, if it's even feels comfortable to get out, if you're worried about, if you have to worry about your own personal safety when you get out, that certainly contributes to social isolation. And then social conditions, that is definitely what we're facing right now. Everything around us advises to stay apart from people, to not gather, to not do these traditional things that have been useful and helpful in helping to maintain our mental health. So let's compare social isolation with loneliness. Loneliness, on the one hand, is subjective. I could be in a room full of people, and yet if I feel that I don't belong, if I feel like I don't have a colleague in that room, if I feel unappreciated in that room, I could still be very lonely. Social isolation, on the other hand, is very objective. Again, it's the number of connections that you have. Do you, even if you live alone, do you have people who call you during the day? So that's a connection. Do you have neighbors that you can talk to over the fence? Do you have people that you're playing words with friends with? What is the number of connections that you have in your life? Loneliness, because it is subjective, is always felt. It's hard to quantify loneliness, but it's something that you know inside that you are feeling. Social isolation, on the other hand, can be calculated externally. I can look at members who attend our adult day center and see the number of family members they live with and the number of other people that they say that they see on a daily basis and calculate their level of social isolation. Loneliness is always an involuntary process. And let's take a step here to say that if a person has a small number of connections, but they are satisfied with those connections, they might not be a lonely person. So if I only have 2 or 3 really, really close friends, but I feel very connected to them, I wouldn't necessarily say that I was lonely. I would feel lonely if I wanted more of those connections and was unable for whatever reason to make them. Social isolation, on the other hand, could be voluntary. I could choose to quarantine because I had been exposed to somebody in the pandemic. I could choose to stay in my house because I don't feel like it's worth the risk to go eat outside on a patio at a restaurant. So social isolation is something that we may have a bit more control over than loneliness. Social isolation encompasses the quality of the relationships. Again, if I am living in a retirement community, and so there are plenty of people around me, but there's nobody that I feel really close to, I could still be very lonely. This is why when we think about people who might be at risk of some of the complications of loneliness and social isolation, you just can't ask if a person lives alone. That might not be an indication. If I am married but do not have a good relationship with my spouse, I could still be very lonely, even though there is somebody there in the room available. Social isolation encompasses access to meaningful relationships as well as the quantity of those relationships. So again, if I live in a retirement home and I have the ability to go eat in the dining room, to go join in on a game, to go listen to a concert, that's a factor of social isolation. I might not be isolated because I have the opportunity to do these things. So let's talk about the negative effects of social isolation and loneliness. And this is sort of the real meat of where social service and public health is focused right now. This, I think, is the most dramatic statistic out there. Loneliness, they say, is as comparable a health risk as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I was reading one book in preparation for this, and the physician who wrote the book just flat out said, loneliness is implicated in just about every medical condition you can think of. But specifically, loneliness is related to hypertension. It's related to cardiovascular disease. It's related to higher incidence of stroke. It's related to cognitive decline and impairment. It's related to a lowered immune system. It's related to a higher stress response. And we're certainly starting to learn how much stress is a harmful to the body. When you consider all of these effects of chronic loneliness together, it results in premature mortality, or the idea that people who are lonely tend to die at a younger age than would otherwise be expected. It also contributes to significant morbidity. That is, people who are lonely tend to experience physical or psychological states that are out of the realm of normal. They might be more likely to be ill, impaired, have degraded health. And it also leads then to increased healthcare costs. I think let's focus a little bit on cognitive decline. As I have worked with older adults over the years, I think that the one thing or the main thing, a main thing that people are concerned about as they age is cognitive decline. And I always try to work into any presentation that I make this idea that dementia, that is cognitive decline, that is so significant that a person is unable to navigate through their day independently. Dementia is never a normal process of aging. It is not to be expected. It is not the way we are designed to age. But but certainly a lot of people are developing dementia, and we are learning more and more about it. So people ask all the time, what can I do to help prevent dementia, or to keep my mind as sharp as possible? And there's a lot of talk about crossword puzzles and brain games and all of those sorts of things. Those are great. I will say that the number one thing to help your brain is to just be in a conversation with somebody, which again gets back to the value of being connected. When I am conversing with someone, I can't predict what you're going to say. You can't predict what I'm going to say. And my brain has got to be very active to follow the conversation and respond appropriately. Let's see. The other, I think, remarkable statistic about the physical effect of social isolation and loneliness is that a person who feels chronically lonely is losing the beneficial effects of exercise on the growth of new neurons. And as we talk about interventions to prevent loneliness and isolation, one of the things we're going to talk about is healthy practices, and certainly regular exercise is a healthy practice. But just think about that. If we're telling people get out and exercise, and yet if a person is feeling very lonely, they're perhaps not getting as much of the benefit from exercise as they could be. So, because I'm a social worker and we always like to talk about things from the positive strengths-based aspect, let's talk about what strong social connections do for you. They provide a sense of safety and a sense of security. Again, we talked about primitive man who, when they felt lonely, were driven to go be part of a group because there is safety in numbers. Being part of a group helps us buffer our stress responses. People who are lonely tend to react more to stressful events, and they tend to, their body tends to be in a stress response mode for much longer than people who are not lonely. Strong social connections help you with your emotional regulation. If we are able to be with people, to chat about what's going on, to vent things with people around us, with our peers, it helps us look at our situation from varying perspectives and perhaps consider what our emotions are and respond in a more nuanced way than we might otherwise. People who are not lonely, people who are connected, tend to have better health behaviors. And certainly we know during this pandemic that continuing to practice healthy behaviors is a useful thing. So being not lonely, being connected helps you increase your motivation for doing those things. And strong social connections also improve a person's access to resources. That's related to that idea of social determinants of health. If you have a network around you who's able to help you meet your basic needs. So, loneliness specifically during COVID-19. There have been headlines since the very beginning of the pandemic that have been talking about the dangers of loneliness. Groups who have faced particular challenges have been those who have been advised to practice extreme forms of isolation. That is, people who are clinically vulnerable, people with diabetes, with lung disease, with impaired immune function to begin with. Those who lived alone particularly faced a higher risk of loneliness during the crisis. And those who have experienced barriers to connecting remotely due to the digital divide. A lot of social service organizations, mine included, pivoted to providing programs and services online, which is great for some people, but if your audience has difficulty connecting online with access to the tools, to the equipment that you need for online access, you're not going to be able to feel those positive effects. Interestingly, people who were used to a high level of contact prior to the lockdown, or who had high expectations of how connected they would be able to continue to be, had a lot of trouble or had proportionally more trouble than others to adjusting to social isolation guidelines. And then the final group that faced sort of extra challenge with loneliness were those who already experienced strains in their relationships. That could be caregivers who are maybe feeling tired, feeling stressed about their caregiving responsibilities. That could be people who are just in a less than healthy relationship with the people closest to them. There have been a lot of surveys of people about loneliness. This one was conducted in the US. It was the National Poll on Healthy Aging. And interestingly, this poll had interviewed people in October of 2018 about their companionship, their subjective level of isolation, about the number of social contacts they had. And across the board, when you compared numbers from October of 2018 to numbers that were gathered between March and June of this year, across the board, people experience more loneliness, less connection, less options to connect. So, who exactly experiences loneliness? Loneliness is a concept that we talk about a lot with older adults, mainly because of the chronic illness and how that affects your ability to connect together, mainly because of sensory impairments and how that affects your ability to connect. So older adults are an enormous focus of social isolation and loneliness. But as we talk about this, I want you to keep in mind that older adults are the most diverse cohort in our society. If you think about it, no two 80-year-olds have arrived at their point in life by the same pathway. If you think about a young child, they have just a smaller number of experiences, and generally perhaps the way they're functioning now is an area about this wide, just about shoulder wide, because they've had a limited number of pathways. But as your life continues on, as it diverges, as you take new and different pathways, you have the opportunity to be part of a whole variety of experiences. So older adults are, on the one hand, have a lot of similarities, may have a lot of limitations due to some similar physical processes, but also are an incredibly diverse group. And because of that, no two older adults, I think, are going to respond in exactly the same way to interventions out there. Other groups that tend to experience loneliness more than, say, the average women, those who live alone, those who are not working, who are unemployed, retired, people in households with less than $60,000 tend to experience more limitation than people who have more financial resources. I think the explanation for that is that if you have money to have tablets and computers to connect to people, or to purchase things that help give your life a sense of purpose, your life will feel a little more richer than if you don't have those opportunities to connect in those ways. People with fair or poor physical health, people with fair or poor mental health, with symptoms of depression, and people ages 50 to 64. I was interested in that particular statistic because, according to one study that I read, people ages 50 to 64 tended to experience higher levels of loneliness than people ages 65 to 80. And I couldn't drill down to find an exact cause for that, but what I speculate is people 50 to 64 are maybe more used to being connected, and so having to be disconnected was maybe more of a shock to them. And then also the idea that older adults, conversely seeming sometimes, are the most resilient people in our community. Even somebody who looks really, really frail probably has a core of resilience in them because of the difficult experiences they've lived through over the course of their life. So let's talk a little bit about some of these cohort characteristics of the silent generation, it's called. These are people born between 1925 and 1945, so they are aged about 75 to 95 at this point. The term silent generation was first coined by Time magazine back in 1951. They're also called the lucky few because they were the first generation that was smaller in number than the preceding generation. So that meant that they had access to a greater proportion of the resources available in the community. Societally, their parents were adults during the Great Depression, and so they were raised by people who had experienced this phenomenon of not having many resources available in the world. They were children of the war, children of World War II. The Depression and the Dust Bowl also was the first time in the US society that social striations got to be blurred. And so they were the first generation to grow up that didn't have such a rigid, perhaps, definition in different social classes. People of this generation were brought up to conform to the norms. They were the children who were taught that they should be seen and not heard. In their experience growing up, there was a perceived risk in speaking freely because of McCarthyism as they approached adulthood. And they tended really to focus on their careers. They were the ones who played by the rules. These are the steps that I should take in my life, and I'm going to follow by them. I am not going to speak out about what I might see or observe differently, because I know that I need to sort of keep my head down and do what I'm supposed to do. For this generation, the key to success really was playing the rules. This could be a factor, I think, that might make it harder for 75 to 90-year-olds to cope with this pandemic. If the rule says you can't be with other people, you can't go out, you can't gather, and yet I am really struggling with that, that would seem to be some cognitive dissonance there. The idea of I should play by the rules, but the rules appear like they are not supporting me right now. So that's, I think, what some of our older adults who are working with are facing. So let's talk about some of the interventions that we or that can be done to help with loneliness and social isolation. Generally speaking, there are two main groups of them. One are things that we ourselves can do for us. So if I am a person who is feeling lonely, we'll talk a little bit about what I should do to help with that. And then there are external support. So if you are a professional who's listening to this, what are some of the things that you can do to help folks that you work with who might be more isolated or isolated in an unhealthy way? And of this second type of intervention, there's sort of three main strategies. The first is to use a person's existing relationships. One of the things that we know about social connections is that they are richer when they are mutual connections, when they're connections that have been given time to develop, when there is a lot of give and take back and forth, when they add purpose to your life. Those are perhaps more significant in an emotional way than casual connections. So one thing we can do as professionals is try to help people tap into what existing relationships they have. We can also change our thinking about relationships. We're going to talk about this more at the very end, but how we can learn to stay engaged in a relationship that may or may not be frustrating. How we can change our thinking about a relationship is a way to continue to maintain it at this time when we certainly need all the connections we can get. And then the third main type of intervention that an outsider can enact is creating new relationships. So thinking about what I can do as an individual, and I've got some things to talk about before we get to these ones on the list here. One of the things that I can do is to cultivate a variety of relationships in my life, to look at who I'm connecting with and try to ensure that I have some people that are really deep connections. That might be family, that might be long-standing friends, and then to also look at casual connections I have. Are there people that I just chat with about, I don't know, over a words with friends game? And so the conversations are pretty superficial. And then look at connections that I have in the community. Even if my connection to my church right now is only over a Zoom service on Sunday morning, that's still a connection. And when you think about it in terms of one type of connection, just one part of this whole array of kinds of connections I can have, it still plays a real vital role in that. One of the things that we can do if we're feeling lonely and frustrated about social isolation is to reframe what we're saying to ourselves about this phenomenon. It's easy, particularly if you're a lonely person and you have a heightened stress response, to grasp onto the, you should be very afraid to be with people. But perhaps we need to reframe that a bit. Maybe we could say we are helping to protect our neighbors by staying away, by wearing a mask. Reframe what we're having to do in terms not of what we are losing, but what we are giving back to the community. Technology could be a part of staying connected, using my phone, making sure that I continue my Words with Friends game or check in with people via Facebook, but it's not always going to be the only solution. So again, we talked about thinking about the types of connections. In terms of people that you have, think about the types of ways that you're connecting with people. It could be that some of the old-fashioned ways of connecting are just as effective and perhaps more satisfying. Writing a note, talking on the phone, not having everything be based in the new and trendy technology. One of the things we've talked about is that just being allowed to socialize might not be enough to reverse the effects of loneliness. If I'm someone who feels lonely when I'm with a group of people, just joining in more groups of people may or may not alleviate the distress that I'm feeling. There's some interesting research, though, that shows that performing an act of kindness is a great way to improve our own mental outlook, even if the person that we did the act of kindness for doesn't necessarily know about it. So perhaps picking up somebody's paper and putting it on their front porch is a way to perform some act of kindness, to get a little charge of self-care out of that, and to be a little bit healthier through this time of social isolation. We talked earlier about one of the dangers of social isolation, or one of the difficulties with it, is losing a sense of control. So figure out what it is that we can control. Perhaps I can control my daily schedule. And so instead of waking up and just drinking endless cups of coffee on the sofa, I might get a little more regimented about what I'm going to do when. Finding some area of your life over which you can gain control might help a little bit with those feelings of losing control. Find a purpose in your life. Everybody needs to feel needed. Even older adults, even people, say in the late stages of dementia, we all need to feel like we matter to the people around us. So perhaps fostering an animal might be a way to feel like you matter to somebody. Even perhaps having a plant that you are nurturing and looking after. There is some research that shows that seeing another living being that's thriving, seeing another living thing that's able to relax, can help us lower our stress response or moderate our stress response. We talked a little about old-fashioned technology being a great thing. Phone calls perhaps are more satisfying than text conversations. So think about tapping back into some of those old-fashioned ways of connecting that we had before. And then other healthy practices, the ones on this list. Interact with the people in your neighborhood as much as you can. There's a lot of data and research that shows that getting outside, having some fresh air, having some sunshine, just getting outside of your own four walls is healthy in and of itself. But interact with people in your neighborhood to the extent that you can. Spending time outdoors, getting enough sleep. Again, that gets back to this idea of having a set schedule. Don't stay up and endlessly binge Netflix shows until 3 a.m. just because you can. Stay on a schedule, get enough sleep, keep your body healthy in that way. Eat a healthy diet and continue to exercise. Before we go on, I want to introduce this idea that if you are someone who's listening to this who is not yet an older adult, one of the unexpected benefits, I think, of this time of social distancing is it might give each one of us a glimpse into what it might be like to be an older adult or to age in the traditional way. Typically speaking, the stereotype is that older adults are not as able to get out and about as they used to. We talked about chronic conditions, mobility, sensory impairments getting in the way. Well, all of us might not have chronic conditions or sensory impairments, but we're getting to experience what it might be like to not be able to move about our life space as freely as we're able to now. And we might do ourselves a real service if we take this time to think about what kinds of things make my life meaningful. If or perhaps when I get to the point that I'm unable to spontaneously get in the car and go out and do something just because I want to, what is it within my home environment or my immediate neighborhood that gives me this sense of purpose? If we think about what's going on right now in terms of how we might experience this as we age, it might help all of us have a bit, be more prepared for some of the effects of aging. I have tried to practice this in my own life. I am a person who fantasizes about the idea of having a long, unstructured day with nothing to do. That just sounds heavenly. Well, I've had a couple of those during this pandemic, and it turns out at the end of the day, it does not feel very heavenly. I feel like I've wasted time. I just feel, I feel like not myself. So this has given me a good glimpse into the idea that when I get to the point that I am not working a 40-hour work week, what am I going to fill that day with? And it is not going to be enough to just be able to not do anything. All right, so how to create or improve social connections. There are certain types of connections that are more satisfying to people than others. A connection that involves mutual sharing, if there is some give and take, that is more satisfying than if it is a one-way transaction. My own experience with my aunt is a perfect example of that. I would love to do a lot of things that would be really helpful to her, and I talk about doing a lot of those things, but she, while I think she's appreciative of it, she would love for there to be more back and forth, for it not just to be me doing things for her. So creating connections that are mutually beneficial. And having a commitment to one another. A lot of new initiatives that have come out of social service organizations have been friendly visitors and pen pals and check-ins, and those things are great and they are necessary, but without some more richness in the conversation other than just a check-in, they may not be in and of themselves sufficient. So let's talk about what are characteristics of effective interventions. Preserving existing social networks. Group interventions, but that have some educational content or have some social support in them. Just joining in on a Zoom where it's a one-way thing is maybe not going to be as meaningful or as rich an experience to somebody as if they are in a group video activity where they're able to contribute as well. Target specific groups with intervention. So think specifically about who it is you're trying to, whose life you're trying to improve, and what are characteristics of that group. And then target the intervention to meet that, as opposed to, here's a blanket pen pal program that we're going to push out to, every older adult in our neighborhood group. Enable some participant control. So what is it that the people who are participating in it want? Do they have a role to facilitate or co-facilitate whatever the intervention is going to be? Include some physical activity. Physical activity just does all sorts of great things to our body and helps you, raises your endorphins, which help you generally feel more cheerful, more positive. So include some physical activity and have it be very participatory. What research has shown is that one-on-one activities in people's own homes are maybe not the most effective thing out there as far as building connections and alleviating loneliness. Certainly meeting somebody one-on-one in their home, ensuring they have resources, getting them things, food, medications, access to services that they need, that is great and necessary. But just dropping by may not be a great thing to alleviate loneliness, again, unless it has this sense of richness and of mutual aid in the relationship. So for social organizations, this is the real dilemma. Group activities seem to be the most effective, but are also the most risky in our environment. And how do we try to reconcile that? The obvious answer is via technology, but there's a lot that we don't know about online interventions. Some of the researchers that I read suspect that, yes, they are great, but they just don't provide the same personal boost that you might get from an in-person group intervention. I know that for me, presentations like this are the perfect example. I love giving a presentation when I have a group in front of me. It is such an energy boost to see people's reactions or be able to take questions during it. And it doesn't feel quite the same to sit here and talk to my computer screen for an hour. So this is something that we're still having to learn to work out. Age of Central Texas, the organization that I work for, is doing our best to try to bridge this dilemma of the idea that online technology might be the best way to stay connected, but it might not be quite as effective. So what can we do to boost it? And we have discovered some best practices. So we developed a program called Virtual Connections. We basically took one of our weekly intervention programs for people in the early stages of memory loss and turned it into a program that meets on the computer. But some of the things that we do to make this a richer experience are we interview everybody before they participate. They go through an intake and they enroll in this program so that we know who is going to be on the other side of the computer screen. And we can deliberately and intentionally involve them in the conversation that's going on. We've also learned that as this pandemic has continued, one of the things, at least that our clients are asking for, is in addition to some of the structured activities that we do, the brain games, the discussion groups, the current events groups that are talking about a specific issue, our people are also wanting more opportunities to make new friends. Again, this biological drive to be connected to people. So we are trying to offer more events that on the one hand are unstructured. It's going to be a social event, and yet we know everybody who's coming. We can make sure that everybody is drawn into the conversation, that they have an opportunity to participate in it. We can support their participation by knowing maybe what difficulties they might have. So all of the interventions are great, and there are a million ideas of ways to stay engaged out there. But at the end of the day, they all rely on the end user being willing to participate in them. And I always say that if I had a nickel for every time somebody asked me, how can I make my mom do X, Y, or Z? Or how can you get my children to stop doing A, B, or C, I would be a rich woman at this point, because it all depends on the end user being willing to do something. And at the end of the day, we cannot make people do things. So the challenge then is, if you know of someone or have a connection to someone who you think ought to do more, ought to have access to more things, ought to be more involved, but yet they're resistant to your ideas of just join this thing or call this person or do this thing. How do we respond to that? This is a question that came up early in the spring when I did a similar seminar about social isolation, and it really sent me out there to think about, what do you do when you know what would be good for somebody, and yet for whatever reason they're not going to take you up on your great and brilliant idea. So I think one of the ways to do that is through a modality called loving kindness meditation. And this is an intervention that aims to change your thinking about the existing relationship. We mentioned earlier on that one of the things that we can do to alleviate social isolation is to think about our relationship. So if I am connected to somebody who I am frustrated by, and my natural tendency might be just to back out of that relationship, and yet that's not, and yet we need to stay connected for whatever reason. How can I do that in a way that is healthier, or how can I be part of that in a way that is less frustrating for me? And loving kindness meditation, I think, will do that. It focuses on people as the object of your attention in order to increase feelings of love, caring, and compassion, not only for yourself, but for other people. It aims to help us be aware of our emotional states, particularly ones that we might automatically fall into, so that we can cultivate the ability to make a conscious choice to act differently in that relationship. The first step to doing this is to build relational agility, to think about how we interact with this person and how we might interact differently with them. And there are a couple of practices to go through to do that. And in the 2 minutes that we have left, I just want to lead us through this. Whoops. So I'd ask you to sit comfortably, put both of your feet flat on the floor, maybe relax your hands in your lap, take a deep breath, and we're just going to walk really quickly through a loving kindness meditation. So the first thing that I would ask you to do is to take a breath in and take a deep breath out. And as you do that, think through these phrases that I'm going to repeat. And later on, you might do this on your own. So breathe in and think, may I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be free from suffering. As you repeat these phrases, settle into the intention of goodwill that they convey. Connect your breath to the positive intentions that you are directing toward yourself. Smile if you would like to. Now take another deep breath and let it out. And bring to mind a person who has cared deeply for you, such as a mentor or a close friend. Focusing on that person and continuing with your breathing, slowly repeat the following phrases to yourselves multiple times. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be free from suffering. And breathe in and breathe out. Finally, in this meditation, you should focus on a person with whom you have a difficulty or a frustrating relationship. Notice what sorts of thoughts and emotions arise. If they are negative, it might help to repeat a few of the phrases, such as these things. You have hopes and dreams, just like me. You have anxieties and fears, just like me. You have known suffering, just like me. And yet you wish to be happy, just like me. Continue with your breath, and then repeat the phrases, again, thinking of this frustrating person. May you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you be free from suffering. Conclude your meditation practice and continue with your day, carrying with you the intentions of goodwill, not only for yourself, but for with others. And I have found, as I have tried to adopt this practice, that it really helps me before I go into seeing somebody that is frustrating to me, to have this idea that I want the best for them and I want this particular interaction to be a good one. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some sources and additional resources. This campaign to end loneliness.org, this is an initiative from the United Kingdom. They have had a council on loneliness for a number of years and are just very proactive on the idea of alleviating loneliness, particularly in older adults. There are a wealth of resources on their website. Here in the United States, we have the National Resource Center for Engaging Older Adults. That poll that I referenced earlier in the presentation is the National Poll on Healthy Aging, and I've given you the link to it. And then the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine here in the United States has published an extensive guide on social isolation and loneliness, and it is available for free online. So that is what I am thinking about social isolation and loneliness right now. And I would love to turn it over to whatever thoughts and questions have come up.
Thank you so much, Annette. That was an incredible presentation. We have someone who is going to read some of the questions from the Q&A that have been submitted.
Sure.
So the first one that we have is about any particular techniques that you can recommend for exercises for the elderly who don't have that much education.
Exercises meaning physical exercise. That's the mindset that I'll go with. So a lot of groups out there are putting exercise resources online. On the first slide on this was the link to the agency that I work for, Age of Central Texas. We have a page on our website that is an entire library of online resources and programs, and there are a lot of exercise groups or programs within that. Also, the Alzheimer's Foundation of America has put on a lot of activities, programs, including exercise online. You just log on to their website and click the link at the right time, and there will be a program going on. There is also a group called Senior Planet, and they can be particularly useful for people that maybe have difficulties with technology, because some of their the resources are online, but some of the resources that they have online are, how to use Zoom and how to get on and how to use particular tools. So with respect to physical exercise, those are the things that come immediately to mind.
Great. Another question that we received was, what specific trainings are being done at nursing homes currently?
I do not work in nursing homes currently, so I don't know specifically what is being done. I have heard that nursing homes have, some nursing homes have had access to funds that enable them to get tablets so that they could facilitate communication between family members via tablet. Other than that, I don't have specific knowledge about nursing homes. I know that the DSHS website, has a particular area around long-term care providers, and it could be that they list some resources for long-term care providers.
Wonderful. I think the last question I see here so far is just if you have any tips for someone who is dealing with loneliness, but may also have some social anxiety as well.
Yeah, that is a tough one, because one of the physical effects of loneliness is it leaves people feeling less motivated or inclined to engage in what might be seen as risky, or they might see connections as riskier as they are. So off the top of my head, what I would think is just joining in a group, I think might feel, at least if it were me, might feel uncomfortable. So I think that I would start with an individual and think about a particular person to potentially reach out to. It's great if that's somebody who's already in the network, who you already have a connection with, or who the person already has a connection with. But in the Austin area, I think reaching out to, if it's an older adult, reaching out to the agency I work for, Age of Central Texas, we have a caregiver support manager, and just describe the scenario, and she can help pinpoint maybe specific resources that might be useful. I think checking with an organization like Meals on Wheels, I know that they do some case management. It could be that they have some ideas and some resources out there. Family Elder Care here in the Austin area has a program called Lifetime Connections Without Walls. That's a phone-based activity program. And actually I said here in the Austin area, but it's based on the phone, so it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody based in the Austin area. If the person that you're thinking about is also someone with a diagnosis of dementia or memory loss, the Virtual Connections program here at Age is that program specifically to connect older adults who have dementia in a intentional and deliberate way online. There is also another website that's just getting launched called A Mighty Fun Time. It's launched by a woman named Amy Temperley here in Austin, and it also is going to be a sort of library of activities and resources for online things. But I think the difficulty with giving maybe the perfect answer for you is that whatever is going to be most effective is going to need to fit in with a person's tendencies and preferences and lifestyle. And so to be able to fit that, you sort of need to know more specifics about the person. So I think the first thing I would do would be to try to reach out to an individual. And certainly the caregiver support manager here at Age would be happy to hear about the situation and try to direct to a specific thing that might seem to be a good fit.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we have here. Thank you so much for being here today, Annette. And thank you again to our sponsor, AARP in Houston. Really got a lot out of this and a good outlook about what we are dealing with right now. So thank you kindly for being with us today.
Thank you. And I'm just able to glance really quickly at the chat, and I see a lot of y'all were putting in the websites that I was mentioning for A Mighty Good Time and some other resources that you know of. This kind of collaboration in the community, I think, is one of the great things about Central Texas, is how willing people are to share. So I certainly appreciate people filling in with those things that they know of.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for being with us, and we will bring you some more webinars soon.